Merhaba sevgili dostlar.
Hello, dear friends, esteemed professors, dear students. In this session, we'll be covering a very important topic with four experts, including educators, philosophers, and also representatives of civil society. So we will be discussing village institutes under these pandemic conditions. Of course, this is a model. Village institutes represent a model that represents a national entity. And especially the fact that this symposium is held in April is because it is important in terms of village institutes. So I would like to thank Sallan, Director Sayın Çiçek, and many others for organizing this symposium. Because Village Institutes is not about an educational model. It is also about the basic philosophy that is based on while founding the Republic of Turkey and bringing up modern, contemporary citizens. The model was launched back in 1940s, but still it is a tool for social development, and it is a project to bring up and train and educate human beings, not only teachers. So it is about a rereading of the history of the Republic of Turkey, and we need this. We need to reread the history of the Republic of Turkey. Why? Because when we consider the relationship between the citizens and the space, the development of villages is an issue of social development, and it is also about access to education. And starting from 1923 Izmir Economic Congress, Mustafa Kemal, Mustafa Necati, who we should definitely remember, dwell on the problem of access to education around Turkey and in villages back then, and that educating villagers was considered a means to educate and facilitate the development of citizens. I'm sure our panelists will be talking about the history of this, but starting from 1936, we have to consider and revisit the history of village institutes. Saffet Arıkan started the process with the education of village teachers, but in 1940, Hasan Ali Yücel was involved. And also, Father Tonguç, as he was called, İsmail Hakkı Tonguç, was involved starting from 1940s. And a very unique model, a unique educational model was built starting from those days. And the modernization of Turkey, apart from the Western modernization, the modernization of Turkey has some pillars. I'll briefly touch upon that and then leave the floor to the panelists, because for the last 3 days, starting from April 14th, we have been listening to renowned speakers, keynote speakers, and panelists, and actually having discussions and panels about Turkish modernity, and some important hints and clues were shared. And one of those was that modernity and modernization, starting from the days of Kant, was all about enabling human beings to, decide their own fate, to engage in self-realization, and to have the courage to use their minds. And therefore, the educational philosophy of village institutes is all about a fact that was neglected for centuries. It's all about the villagers and the village life. And the anthem that we listened shortly before says in its lyrics that we are the villagers, we are the masters and owners of this country. And yes, villagers are the real owners of the community, of the society. And this educational model was based on that premise. Gramsci says, talks about organic intellectuals. And this is also relevant. Capitalism, feudalism, the marginalized segments of the society actually represented the community, the society itself, both in terms of a revolution of history, of philosophy, of education. This was an important model, I can say. It was not only a project. 17,000 teachers were educated and about 1,600 medical staff were trained at village institutes. In 1946, about 40% of teachers were educated and trained at village institutes. Why is this important? Because intellectual teachers evolve themselves, improve themselves. They also help villagers to improve and develop themselves. And they always underline that production is important and self-development is important, and that producers should have a say in certain aspects of the society. And Turkish modernization actually differentiates from the Western, both Western and Eastern modernization in many aspects. So this self-conflict was reinterpreted during Turkish modernization, and the practices of the village institutes were very important. And it is about being able to think about some changes and actually implementing those changes. This is also what rationalism requires. And the praxis of this model was a factor that underlined and underscored the success of village institutes. And regarding expectations from village institutes, İsmail Hakkı Tonguç, I would like to quote İsmail Hakkı Tonguç. Village institutes, he defines village institutes and young people as such. They first learn how to think and then how to express their thought. And when they were in the presence of a governor or a pasha, they will not be dominated. In their struggle for acquiring their rights, they will be deciding their own fates. So the village institutes and the people at the village institutes are the people of the republic. And İsmail Hakkı Tonguç talks about exploitation as well. And he says the village institutes is not only the sound of the students, but also among the citizens of women, of young people. I worked at Gönen Village Institute, Gönen Village Institute, and Fakir Baykurt has an important quote. As you know, Fakir Baykurt is not only a teacher trained at Village Institute, but also is a poet, he's an educator, and he's an intellectual who had his origins at Village Institute. And in Izmir, he started an organization and took it to the Teachers Union of Turkey. And in 1970s, he organized, he enabled the organization of hundreds of thousands of teachers. And he wrote a poem. I would like to quote, "I will study for 5 years and I'll become a teacher. There are lions all around. Oh, lions with manes in the wind. So we will be getting rid of the worm that eats us inside." So the teachers will be the torches of enlightenment. So this was a struggle. Village institutes were a struggle for the independence and freedom of the country. So without much ado, I would like to leave the floor to the panelists. The first speaker will be Kemal Kocabaş from a Faculty of Education. but he's also the son of a teacher who studied at the Village Institute. So this transformation, this awareness that the Village Institute aimed at is visible in Kemal Kocabaş's education. So welcome. And we also have a philosopher from Ankara University, Hasan Haluk Erdem. And he will be speaking about the educational philosophy and the societal perspective against the context of the Village Institutes. And we also have Firdevs Gümüşoğlu from Mimar Sinan University of Fine Arts, from the Department of Sociology. So we have very distinguished panelists, and in their presence before them, I don't want to make a part declaration. So each panelist will have 20 minutes of time, and Firdevs has to leave at 2. So I'll give the floor to Firdevs and Kemal first. And before Firdevs leaves, if there are any questions to her, before she leaves, we will have the questions to Firdevs, and then she'll leave. And if the time will not be enough, we will have a second round of, taking the floor and making contributions. Thank you in advance for your contribution. And now I'd like to give the floor to Kemal Kocabaş. Songül, thank you very much. Just a small correction. I'm from the Department of Physics at 9 Eylül University, but that's fine. Esteemed friends, dear colleagues, we are celebrating the 81st year of establishment of the Village Institutes, and it's been 67 years since the Village Institutes were closed. In no other country, an educational model that's been closed down 67 years ago is discussed, So I would like to remember the founders of Village Institute and those who contributed to the educational reform and revolution in the Republic. As you said, Songül, this is a movement of enlightenment. And on the soil of Turkey, this courageous act was triggered and driven by Mustafa Kemal. In 15th of July 1921, an educational congress was held, and the population was around 13 million, and the literacy rate was around 5 and 6%, as Mustafa Kemal stated. And therefore, the first objective was to solve the issue of access to education in villages. So the Republic was inherited with the Ottoman, a very deconstructed Ottoman society. And yes, Satır Bey, İsmail Hakkı Baltırcıoğlu, İsmail Mahir Efendi, and many others actually contributed to education at villages and local education in the Ottoman times, actually. And then came the French Revolution, the discussions, educational discussions in Europe, and the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. And then it came down to the Republic of Turkey, and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç and Hasan Ali Yücel contributed to this. In 1923 Izmir Economic Congress, we can see the traces of the Village Institutes in the education report. That there should be some barns and some animals and certain physical means at village schools, and that teachers should engage in agriculture with students. And on March 1st, 1923, Mustafa Kemal addressed the parliament, and he says, the method in education should focus on human beings, citizens, and it should not be a means of oppression, he says. This is what the founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, says. So I'll try to bring in a historical perspective and then talk about some key points of the model in Village Institutes. So between 1923 and 1946, Mustafa Necati was the Minister of Education between 1926 and 1929, and Saffet Arikan actually succeeded him, and then came others, but they all looked from the same perspective, that all children should be schooled. And that is why there was an integral approach, an integrated approach to that end, in the minds of the Minister of National Education. And Mustafa Necati was the 6th Minister of Education, and he was an intellectual. And there was the Gazi Institute of Education, and also there was the establishment of the Board of Education and Discipline, Turkish Education Board. And in 1924, there are 46,000 villages, and only 1,400 of them had schools. Mustafa Necati underwent a surgery of appendicitis and then leaves, and then there was a void at the ministry, but then comes Reşit Galip. He has two important contributions, the community, society, chambers as they call it, and society houses. And these are very important, and many people from the village institute says, you know, I read books and I got married even at the community center. So this is important. And then came the universities afterwards, of course. So Hasan Ali Yücel and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç are the two key names. Hasan Ali Yücel was born in 1897. He studied philosophy. He's an intellectual, an author, and he also composed songs and still sang actually and play. Actually, he was first a teacher, then an inspector, and then a general director at the ministry, and then became a member of the parliament, and then the minister of national education. So in the history of the republic, he represents an important example of merits. And then I'd like to speak about İsmail Hakkı Tonguç, born in 1893 in a village in Bulgaria back then, and studied at teachers' schools at Istanbul and Kastamonu, and studied fine arts abroad. He's an intellectual, and he's the only person to make into the World Atlas of Pedagogy, and he was a patriot. And any sacrifice should be made to facilitate the development and education of villages. So it means the Republic was not able to make its way to poor people at villages, and he said it was very important to cover them and embrace them as well. In our day, how do we position education? Pedagogy makes this definition. There are some innate skills and competencies, and then these are used as a tool for improvement. And İsmail Hakkı Tonguç says the traditional schooling methods that oppresses children should be replaced by a modern educational model. So the definition, the contemporary definition, coincides with and overlaps with İsmail Hakkı Tonguç's definition. And there was the trainers courses, as they were called back then. The idea was born by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and the poor kids from villages were actually able to get brief training, military training to use, guns and to study certain things during the War of Independence. So, and İsmail Hakkı Tonguç sees that the surgeons making their way back to their villages after military service was actually assuming very important roles in their villages as administrators. So, to run education and to guide villagers and to facilitate the training of teachers are just some of, and to engage in agriculture are just some of the missions of the village institute. So it's not about training teachers. It will also contribute to village life. And in only a training course of 6 months, the course participants were able to assume this responsibility. The trainers' seeds, the trainers' chickens, you know, there are such definitions in villages. And about 8,500 trainers were first trained at village institutes, but later on they were not able to, some of them were not able to get employed. So trainers courses was an important milestone on the way to the village institutes. And İsmail Hakkı Tonguç wrote a book back then, and it's quite apparent that village was, you know, in terms of the education and development of villagers, the local means and the means at villages was quite important. In 1930s, late 1930s, there was an education congress, and the Minister of National Education says there are urgent measures to be taken to make sure that there is no one that has been left behind in terms of schooling. So as a principle, we are dwelling on establishing village schools to train teachers, local teachers. So trainers courses and the first educational congress were important milestones on the way to the village institutes. And April 17, 1940, the law number 3800 comes to the parliament. Most of the population of Turkey live in villages, and the villagers need education, and handicrafts and professions and vocations should be taught at these villages. And it's also important to train and employ teachers at these schools. So this is the rationale for the law. And there are some population statistics. 23% of men and 8% of women in Turkey back then were literate, were able to read and write. So it was a great situation. It was like the Middle Ages back then, and there are heated discussions at the parliament. The first discussion was about why an institute were established. This is a feudal approach, and Hasan Ali Yücel had an important skill of rhetorics, and therefore he explained very clearly that these village institutes, another landlord actually asked the question. These people think, local people think they are Atatürk. Hasan Ali Yücel says they're representing a reform, a revolution, and I'm proud of them. And out of 400 deputies, 150 deputies do not attend the voting, but 250 vote for the law, and the law is enacted. And Hasan Ali Yücel thanks the deputies. Village institutes is a unique model. It is not an imitation, and it goes well with the spirit and nature of Turkish people. It's not about pedagogy. It is an important, a basic model for the development of the country. Let's look at Article 1 of the Village Institutes Law. Article 1 reads as follows. Village teachers and village other professionals at villages will be trained shall be trained at village institutes. Okay, teachers are there, and health professionals and trainers and educators were trained at village institutes. If village institutes could have survived longer, you know, imams and veterinarians and other professionals could have been trained and educated at village institutes. But in 1940s, fascism was on the rise in Europe, and still in Turkey, village institutes were established. And it was important to have village institutes close to railways. So this was also relevant to the line in the 10th year march. And as Songül stated, this is a design for civilization. It was a school of agriculture, a school of music, a school of sports, a school of social responsibility. And I would like to underline this point. A question. Where were the village institutes established? Was the country covered as a whole? If we divide the map of Turkey into four, in each region there were about 3 or 4 village institutes, and they were named after the region they were established, and this was meaningful especially. Another question is, in places where village institutes were established, were there ready buildings? No, there were no buildings. The buildings were constructed by the students, by the teachers, by the managers, and village institutes did that. Only one of the village institutes had a building from the American mission, and other than that, all buildings of village institutes were constructed by students and trainers and teachers. At Halk TV, I repeated the same. In Europe, all middle-age buildings are preserved, but these buildings that were built in 1940s in Turkey are not preserved at all. This is a sad issue. So life at village institutes begin in tents at first, and then with solidarity and joint work and cooperation, the buildings were constructed. But how can we summarize the experience at village institutes? We can say that village institutes is the first example of scientific work. Mustafa Necati, Saffet Arıkan periods were, and the achievements from their times were the basis. And village institutes were a school that provided positive discrimination for girls and for poor students as well. And poor students were trained there, and about 1600, 1700 girls were educated there without examinations on admission. And for 50% of courses were social and 50% were practical courses. And they include